Afternoon, good morning. Good morning to all of you joining us from the US and Canada. I'm Martin Quencez. I'm the director of the Paris office of the German Marshall Fund and managing director of our Risk and Strategy program. I'm very happy to moderate this conversation today, titled Indo-Pacific and China, What to Watch in 2023. This event is part of our partnership with the Canadian Embassy in Paris, and I want to thank our partners to make it possible to hold this conversation today. The goal of this discussion is really to have some sort of prospective work on what to look at the political, economic, and security levels in the Indo-Pacific and how it will impact North American and European partners. And to think of it, actually, there's a lot of ground that needs to be covered in a bit less than an hour. We want to talk about the political situation in China, a few months after the 20th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. We want to talk about also the political and economic situation in the context of the transition from the zero COVID policy. We want to talk about security aspects of the Indo-Pacific region with regards to Taiwan or Korea. We want to talk about some very specific diplomatic events that will take place in the coming weeks and months, thinking about US Secretary of State visits to China in February 5th and 6th, as well as the G7 summit in Japan or the G20 summit in India later this year. So definitely a lot to discuss. But what I've asked the two speakers to do is to give us a sense from their perspective. And the goal of this dialogue is to have a Canadian and a European perspective sort of dialogue on these issues, how it is perceived from where they stand, and perhaps also to identify 3 or 4 main trends that we all need to have in mind when we think about the Indo-Pacific, when we think about China in 2023. So each of them will have 10-12 minutes for introductory remarks, after what I will use the questions that you can already write in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'll take questions directly from the participant and submit them to the two speakers. So without further ado, let me introduce our 2 excellent panelists today. First, Alice Ekman. Alice Ekman is the senior analyst in charge of the Asia portfolio at the EUISS, the European Institute for Security Studies. She's a known China expert who's published many books on the topics that we'll discuss today, the latest being Dernier vol pour Pékin, released in French in November 2022. Thank you very much, Alice, for being with us. And then I'll turn to Jeff Nankivell, is the president and CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. He was the Canadian Consul General in Hong Kong and Macau until 2021. He's had different functions as well at the Canadian Embassy in Beijing. He was also in the Canadian International Development Agency and an excellent expert to talk about both China, the Indo-Pacific, but also the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy, which was released most recently. I will perhaps first turn to you, Jeff, to give us your sense of these many different issues, and then have Alice give the European perspective. So, Jeff, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Merci. Bonjour, bon après-midi, tout le monde. Good morning and afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks to the German Marshall Fund for inviting me. Let me start a lot that I think Alice and I can cover in the hour, but I'll start with Canada and the Indo-Pacific. So Canada finally has a national Indo-Pacific strategy among the last of the countries you might expect to have such a strategy, to actually put one out. I should note it's extremely rare for governments in Canada to publish foreign policy strategies. It's not something that is habitual. It's not something that is common in the political culture of Canada. National governments rarely publish white papers, for instance, on strategy issues, and you would have to look pretty far in the past to see a definitive Canadian foreign policy strategy document. So it's a milestone, and the fact that the government in Ottawa chose to do this for the Asia region or the Indo-Pacific region is in itself a very significant development. And the fact that the foreign minister, Mélanie Joly, was able to rally her cabinet colleagues behind a strategy that involved a couple of $1 billion US in new funding for initiatives in Asia was also significant. The strategy came out last November, just 2 months ago, and it came out at a time when public attention, media attention in Canada was focused, as in many other countries around the world, was focused on cost of living issues and inflation. And as far as foreign affairs matters were concerned, all eyes were on the Russian war in Ukraine. So this was a very significant development for the government of Justin Trudeau. We've seen nothing like this level of commitment to Asia by a Canadian government in the past couple of generations at least. And the strategy itself that came out, it reads not too differently from the other strategies that some of you who follow these things would have seen by other national governments and by the EU. It's about 25 pages and has sections on different parts of Asia. It really represents two things that were bolted together. There was an Asia strategy that was at least 5 years in the making and was long overdue, and lays out some Canadian priorities for engaging commercially, diplomatically, and on security issues across the region. I have to say, Canadians looking at Asia have looked historically primarily through a commercial lens. Security does come into this increasingly, and I'll come in a minute to the role that China plays in the way that Canadians look at Asia today. But really, the predominant focus of Canadian attention on Asia historically has been on economic opportunities and how best to access economic opportunities. So we have two pieces that came together, an Asia economic strategy that was long in the making, and then a China strategy and a kind of a positioning on China for the current government of Mr. Trudeau in Ottawa, that represents a pretty significant development in the official posture of the government in Ottawa towards Beijing, stating very clearly, characterizing China as a disruptive power on the global stage and a challenge, and representing challenges to Canada and Canada's allies and friends in a number of areas, challenges that need to be addressed. And so you have these two things that came together. The strategy itself is a serious one when it comes to an approach to Asia. As I mentioned, a couple of $1 billion, which is a lot in Canadian foreign policy terms, on spending for defense and on diplomatic initiatives, and on support for Canadian companies, to engage in the region. At the same time, there is, I think there is an issue for Canadian diplomatic efforts in the region. There's a focus in the strategy on Southeast Asia as an area of opportunity. This will be familiar. We see this in the Asia or Indo-Pacific strategies of other outside actors in Western Europe, Australia, the United States, the UK. A focus on Southeast Asia, ASEAN, as an area of great opportunity, as an area where Canada needs to invest more resources, and resources are there in the strategy. I think the diplomatic challenge for Canada in the region will be that the way this strategy was rolled out, it was positioned, it was previewed in a speech by the foreign minister, Madame Joly, in Toronto in November, before the strategy was actually published. A couple of weeks before it was released in full, she gave a speech in Toronto that was all about the China challenge and was all about quite a sober and fairly dark view of China and its ambitions in the region and in the world, and the need for Canada to rise to the challenge and to work with like-minded countries to do that. In the strategy itself, that section is the first section of the actual document, and I think it's significant because for Canadian diplomatic efforts in Southeast Asia and in South Asia to a lesser extent, but particularly in Southeast Asia, I think we are seeing that there's a bit of a challenge if the strategy, which was welcomed by countries in Southeast Asia who are interested in developing greater relations with Canada, they welcomed the strategy, but they were alarmed by the kind of Cold War messaging that they saw in the strategy. And I know Canadian diplomats in the region have faced questions from counterparts in Southeast Asia. Is this an anti-China strategy? What's the role really of Southeast Asia in Canada's thinking? Or is Southeast Asia strategy for Canada just an aspect of a larger China strategy? So I think that will be a challenge for the government, but it does show that it's really hard from North America. It's hard to look across the Pacific at Asia and not have China be right in the center of your field of vision. In terms of Canada and China and that relationship, interestingly, through a period of quite frosty diplomatic relations, and some of you will be familiar with the 3-year saga of Madame Meng Wanzhou being detained in Canada for extradition to the U.S. Case eventually resolved, and our two Michael Kovrig, Michael Spavor, arbitrarily detained and eventually released as the Meng case was resolved. Through that period, the coldest diplomatic relations that I've seen in 3.5 decades of working on Canada-China and Canada-Asia issues. But throughout that period, Canadian exports to China continued to climb quite steadily. Imports from China also rose actually at an even greater pace, and investment in both directions didn't really suffer a major hit. Chinese foreign investment into Canada has leveled off in the last few years, but it hasn't significantly declined, although the prospects for the future are somewhat constrained by political moves in Canada, as in other countries, including in the U.S. and Western Europe and Australia. New measures that are being brought in by the government of Canada on national security review of proposed foreign investments in areas like critical minerals or advanced technologies. That said, investment in both directions between Canada and China did continue to climb. I think in terms of that relationship going forward, I think China, the leaders in Beijing, would probably rather have a good relationship with Canada than a bad relationship, but I'm not sure that they're prepared to invest a lot of effort or political capital in building a better relationship than the one that exists now. And on the Canadian side, certainly Canadian public opinion, as in many other countries, Canadian public opinion has shifted quite significantly vis-a-vis China in the last 3 years to a much stronger focus on the kind of threat view of China as opposed to the opportunity view, and I don't expect that to change in the near term. For China, looking ahead, I was recently in Hong Kong and Singapore and talking with business people and diplomats. I think there is a significant development, and we'll see it play out over the next few years, that confidence both domestically and internationally in the quality of economic management and decision-making, political decision-making in China, I think has declined. There have been a number of things that happened in the last year, in particular, the collapse of the property industry in China, which affects millions of households and their savings, the abrupt about face going from a very strict and very painful and politically painful zero COVID lockdown strategy to going to a complete opening so abruptly. I think these things undermine confidence in the leadership. I think the leadership changes that we saw with the Party Congress you now have in place a core of leadership around Xi Jinping, which, with one or two exceptions, these are men who have had their whole career accompanying Xi Jinping through different jobs. I think that the lack of diversity in that group, in terms of their life experience, in terms of their factional outreach within the party, is something that is going to handicap decision-making by the leadership. The shock of the news for some people that China's population is now shrinking and that India in 2023 will be the most populous country in the world for the first time in centuries. That's not, we've known this is coming for a long time, but I think the fact that it's coming faster than anticipated is going to pose real challenges. I think the international investor community is waking up to this. I would just note politically that the one-child policy, which is in large measure responsible for the demographic situation China finds itself in, was a signature policy of the Chinese Communist Party. Millions of party workers were involved in implementing it over the years, and there's hardly a family in China that wasn't touched by it over the last few generations. So for Chinese citizens now to hear that there is a huge demographic challenge and that the one-child policy reversal that happened half a decade ago has come too late is something else that I think will undermine the party's legacy. Finally, just a word on Hong Kong. I think Hong Kong's role as a hub for Asia operations of multinational financial institutions and corporations is something that has really changed over the last 3 years. Through the COVID lockdown really was crippling for international operations of financial institutions who were trying to exercise Asia-wide functions from Hong Kong over the last few years, coupled with the impacts of the national security law imposition in 2020 and the very visible and very thoroughgoing political crackdown in Hong Kong and the assertion of party control directly, more or less, in Hong Kong, has led to a real change in perception in the international community, but also among wealthy mainland Chinese households, family offices, company operations, private company operations, who are moving their assets out of Hong Kong to places like Singapore for various reasons that we can discuss. I think for the multinational financial institutions, what you are seeing is Asia wide functions are tending to be moved from Hong Kong to Singapore, while the China-facing functions remain in Hong Kong. And there's still a very good living to be made by Hong Kong as a financial hub for China and as the place through which investment flows to and from China. And the final thing I'll note is I think you'll see a real tension in the coming years in Beijing's economic policies, a tension between a desire to see the renminbi become internationalized and to see a wider international use of China's currency as a way to escape the threat of the kinds of financial sanctions that that everyone has observed imposed on Russia. There's a big market for that argument out there in the world among authoritarian leaders in particular that would like to get out from under the US dollar clearance sanctions threat, or the threat that comes through the role of the US dollar. But there's a big tension in economic policy between trying to internationalize the renminbi at the same time as needing to maintain capital controls, because there's no question that if you allowed free flow of capital in and out of mainland China, that wealthy individuals, families, as well as corporate interests would very quickly be doing everything they could to move assets offshore, and that's not a risk that the party can afford to take. And I think you'll see a real tension there between those two objectives, and I think that'll be something to watch for closely in the coming year and the coming years.
Thank you very much, Jeff. A lot already to discuss, and I'll come back to you with some questions. I also invite all of you to ask your questions if you want in the Q&A box at the bottom. But let me turn to Alice for your perspective on the main trends in 2023.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you to GMF. Thanks to GMF for the kind invitation. Very happy to share my views. I've structured my brief presentation looking specifically at what to expect from China in 2023. And I will here underline 4 trends, which are not exhaustive. First trend, China is not fully reopening. That's my analysis, but I think it's interesting to question the level of openness of China. You know, we hear a lot of comments here that China may be reopening. By the way, yes, indeed, the zero COVID policy is over, and it was a surprise for many of us, as much as it was a surprise to witness a street demonstration a few weeks ago, and to witness, you know, for us China analysts, it's very hard now to decipherate and to identify long-term trends regarding China, because we have been identifying a lot of sudden decisions regarding COVID-19 policy, but also very mixed message regarding the level of openness of the Chinese economy. If you read Liu He's speech at Davos, really underlined that China is now open economically. And also we have been hearing analysis saying that we are towards the end of the Wolf Warrior diplomacy. Some referring to the change of position of Zhao Liqian, one of the MFA spokesperson. All these elements, and also, sorry, another point to mention as a hypothesis, we also have been hearing that it's the end of the crackdown on Chinese internet company. Looking, for instance, at the fact that earlier this month, Guo Shuting, who is CPC secretary of the People's Bank of China, announced that the rectification work of 14 financial technology companies had basically been completed. And also we have been seeing that DD Global secured the green light to put its main app back into the country's app store. So we have many indications that China seems to reopen. My analysis is that we should not in 2023, and as long as Xi Jinping is in power, because we have to remember that, right? We are still under the same leadership of the same president and the same political party. So as long as Xi Jinping is still in power, I think we should not expect a proper reopening of China as we expect it or we hope for. First of all, we have been seeing retaliation measures towards countries who have requested COVID tests, for example, regarding visa issuance for Japanese or Korean citizens, among other citizens. China is likely to promote what is often called tourist diplomacy by channeling tourist flows to thank countries who are rather positive about China on the same political line as China, but also to sanction countries who are not. We've been seeing that previously towards Taiwan, but towards South Korea, and this is likely to come back. At least we are seeing signs of that. Regarding economic openness, seriously, I'm very doubtful that Liu He's call should be taken seriously. I'm not saying it's not an interesting speech. I'm just saying that Xi's opening speech at the party congress should be taken even more seriously, And he clearly underlined that it's time to promote what the CPC called a new development philosophy. And it's also time to put an end to Western imported, well, I didn't mention Western imported in his speech, but in other communication. But in his speech, he mentioned that it's time to put an end to hedonism as a cult of money, egocentrism, and all these ideas that, according to him and the party, are imported from the West and are, I would say, deviation from China's correct spirit of socialism with Chinese characteristics. And we've been witnessing, as you know, in recent years, a crackdown not just on technology, but also on private education, on entertainment. And I expect that this crackdown will extend to other economic sectors. And also, I even expect that this crackdown will extend to consumer practices, with more incentive to consume Chinese, and with more incentive to consume moderately, to put an end of this so perceived debauch of a Western type of consumption. I know it sounds a bit surprising when we look at the new revival of shopping in China, of buying, I would say, praise, and also we know we are familiar with middle and upper middle class practices of a consumer in Shanghai or Beijing, but the party line is very clear about the need to correct that practices. So China, I think, is not opening economically. I'm not saying there is not an adjustment from the zero COVID policy, but I think we should not be too optimistic about openness of the Chinese economic system. I'm not saying neither the end of the Wolf Warrior diplomacy, looking at the communication on Chinese embassy in Paris, but also looking at the other spokesperson from the MFA who are still in position to communicate, and they are communicated in rather tough words, their position as usual. Also, in any case, even if there was an adjustment of China's Wolf Warrior diplomacy, which we are not seeing so far, according to me, the practices and the words of previous years have, has had consequences on China's partners in Europe and in Australia, in Canada, I believe, in the US, of course, and other countries. I mean, it's hard to go back to the smooth and friendly type of traditional diplomatic communication that was hoped for before, just because the words were so strong and the practice sanction and counter-sanction were so sudden and large. I'm thinking about, of course, sanction towards Lithuania, and that also led the EU to think about an anti-coercion mechanism. So I don't think it's the end of the Wolf Warrior diplomacy. Obviously, we are witnessing a clear, I would say, charm offensive from China towards Europe, the EU and several member states. It's obvious, but according to me, it's a superficial move. The charm offensive is real. We hear a lot about the need to cooperate, the need to restore dialogue, to meet more often. As you know, we have many visits of European leaders planned, or several visits of European leaders planned to China. President Macron is likely to visit China in April. Meloni as well is planned to be visiting China at some point this year. But on the content of the dialogue, I don't expect China to adjust its position, being, of course, on human rights, Xinjiang, on Hong Kong. And most of all, I don't expect China to adjust its position on the war in Ukraine. As you know, China's diplomacy is still rejecting the word war. It's not using it at all in its communication, preferring the word crisis, or in some instances conflict. China has reinforced has developed its energy cooperation in recent months with Russia to a great extent. As you know now, Russia is the first source of oil for China since last May. In general term, we have not seen any willingness of China to isolate Russia. Far from that. On the contrary, we have seen efforts of China to maintain Russia in diplomatic fora of various kind, and China even voted against the expulsion of Russia from the Human Rights Council of the UN. In the end, it was expelled, of course, but all this indicates that I think, I mean, we can discuss, because it's a whole topic in itself, China-Russia relationship, to put into context, but I don't see sign of distanciation from Beijing toward Moscow so far. And we might even see sign of further partnership. As you know, Vladimir Putin said in December that he was expecting Chinese President Xi Jinping to make a state visit to Russia in spring 2023, to be confirmed by the Chinese side, but this is not excluded so far. Of course, that would send a very strong signal of further rapprochement. So first, China is not fully reopening, according to me. Second, China is unlikely to change its position towards the war in Ukraine, or what it calls crisis. Third, China is likely to continue to promote a very, very active diplomacy, with success or not, but the willingness to be proactive is there. Are several signs of it. Recent sign, as you saw, the new Foreign Minister Ting Gang's conducted this month a week-long African tour to Angola, to Gabon, Benin, and Egypt. This is, I would say, rather common, but it shows the strategic importance of what China calls developing world in promoting its interest and also gathering support ultimately at the UN. China also is planning to host a new Belt and Road Forum in 2023. That would be the third edition, but it marks a bit, I would say, the renewal of past initiatives that it had promoted before COVID. In general terms, China has been rather active to try to make the BRICS summit that it hosted last year more meaningful and larger in the future, and China is likely to continue to take an active part in any BRICS affiliated meetings and the summit that is planned to take place in South Africa. And all this active diplomacy is not going, I mean, it's very comprehensive, but it's not going in towards all direction. It has a clear objective that is, according to me, coalition building. China has a coalition building strategy that is clearly presented black and white on paper. Xi Jinping's New Year speech in 2018 already talked about and the need to enlarge China's circle of friends. So it's not, a system of alliance. As you know, China is against the term alliance, the concept of alliance, which is considered it's a heavy burden, it's too costly, it's old-fashioned, whatever. China is not planning to create a new form of NATO in Asia, but China is determined to fight against any attempt to renew the US-led alliance, being in the Pacific and beyond. As you know, Wang Yi characterized what he calls the US Indo-Pacific strategy as illegitimate and doomed to fail. He said that during an annual press conference in March 2022 and in further communication in May. We are seeing very strong Chinese official reaction to AUKUS. We are also seeing very hostile reinforcement of already very hostile perception of NATO and its enlargement, and very hostile comments on Japan's new security strategy. Just as an example, it's not a fully official, but of course it's a state media. Global Times titled in January 15 an op-ed as follows: Japan risks turning itself into Ukraine of Asia if it follows US strategic line, referring to the so-called militarization of the country and the threat that it may face if it continues that direction. So more tension to be expecting, I believe, not just from that article, of course, but in general position and what we hear in Beijing, more tension to be expected with Japan, especially before and in the margin of the G7. And in general terms, the coalition building objective of China should be taken seriously. I know it's not as strong and as formal as as the alliance that we know. But still, through tech partnership, through reinforcement of infrastructure development, the BRI is still in place, also with many obstacles and criticism. But many countries are still very open to China's initiative and China's services and goods. And I believe that China will continue to reach out to countries that are that they believe can be on the side of China in many multilateral framework. I mentioned the UN, but we could also think about the BRICS, etc. To conclude, and all in all, I also believe that China is serious about self-reliance in the field of technology. There was this incentive, this clear message about self-reliance in the speech of Xi Jinping on the Congress. China has been investing massively, tripled its R&D expense over the last 10 years, according to official declaration. Hard to double check, of course, but we know that China had a dedicated semiconductor plan. We were hearing 2 years ago that China would not be able to catch up, regarding these specific products. Well, it starts to be able to produce advanced last generation semiconductors. Is still lagging behind, but step by step, I think China is investing massively in innovation, in technology, with the final aim to be, of course, much less dependence, not just on US tech companies, including, of course, in the context of the tech sanction and counter sanction that are in place, but in general term, less dependent on foreign technologies, including European technologies. So all this to say that the charm offensive that we are witnessing from China towards Europe, I believe, is superficial. It's interesting to note, maybe to engage, but not in a too naive way, because the general trends that we've been witnessing over the last 10 years under Xi Jinping, and most of all in the last 5 years since the previous party congress, are very much still relevant and to be consolidated by the leadership in the next 5 years up to the 21st party congress, and probably be even beyond if Xi Jinping's is still in power, which is likely.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you very much. Maybe a couple of questions to start the discussion. Question to both of you, actually, on something that you mentioned at the Analyst, which is the difficulty to have accurate data on the economic situation in China. We see, over the past few weeks, very different projections on the growth level of China in 2023. So what I maybe would like to hear from you is less to discuss these projections and more to have your view on the Chinese financial ability to fund its ambitious and active foreign policy, as you describe it, Alice, to be able to sustain the kind of engagement in the world with the Belt and Road Initiative and further investments in what they call the developing world. Are you sort of on the side of those who have some doubts in terms of China's ability to actually pay for what it promised to those countries? A question maybe for you, Alice, more specifically, what is there to expect from these potential state visits from European leaders to China during the spring? You mentioned Emmanuel Macron, Giorgia Meloni. What do you think could come out of those visits, maybe to compare them to Olaf Scholz's meeting last year? And last, also from Jeff, if you could elaborate a bit on what do you see are the main factors that will define the situation in Taiwan and on the China-Taiwan relation. What is there, from your perspective, that could be a trigger of either an escalation or another form of maybe an improvement of the situation at the security level? So maybe first Jeff, and then I'll turn to Alice.
Well, those are some very big questions, Martin. So I think the issue of China's finances and the non-transparency of the government's budget situation, and I think the biggest issue there is how much we don't know. And the budgeting process for the central government has never been particularly transparent. I remember working in the embassy, and those of us who are used to dealing with budgets of governments in countries like Canada or France or Germany, or the EU budget and so on, we're used to getting a budget of hundreds of pages or 1,000 pages and lots of details to pore over. And in China, you would get at the National People's Congress, you would get a 3-page speech. So it's really hard to look behind. There's a lot of questions. This is a long-standing issue. A lot of questions about the level of local government debt, and the overall, clearly the overall debt, debt loads for China, private and public, are becoming an issue. And this situation, I wouldn't underestimate the impact of the property sector situation. This is almost a third of the Chinese economy, and it's in a really, really precarious state, and the prospects are not good in 2023 for China to grow its way out of that situation. That said, the underlying, there's underlying strength in the economy, and China has historically always been able to grow its way out of systemic financial risks. But I think it is, to me, it's still an open question in terms of Belt and Road, how sustainable the first half decade, or the first decade, I guess now, the first decade of investment is, how sustainable that pace is in the longer term. And we don't know what kind of conversations are going on internally in Beijing and within the leadership about the priorities for investment when you have an economy that has slowed to kind of Western European rates of growth in the last year, or Western European or North American rates of growth. There's got to be a serious reexamination. So I don't have a prediction to make about that. It will be interesting, and it was good of Alice to point out, there's now going to be renewed Belt and Road activity. This is a signature policy of Xi Jinping. It's one that is, one of the most clearly identifiable signature policies of his leadership period over going back a decade. So I assume there will be a rallying within the system in China to ensure that there is new momentum for Belt and Road. And I think the issue that Alice very correctly raises of China's coalition building, these things are related, and there is a strategy, and I think it's been given new urgency by the observation of how the non-geographic West came together on financial sanctions on Russia, that I think probably surprised the leadership in Beijing to see the extent, the speed, and the comprehensiveness of the sanctions response, and the fact that it continues to be ratcheted up on Russia. And we haven't seen countries really breaking ranks on that. This is really alarming, and it has to have an impact, I think, on Beijing's thinking when it comes to Taiwan, which is the other thing that you asked about. I think the balance in Taiwan, I think it's always been the situation. It's been, for the last half century, certainly in the last 20 years, it's been the situation that if ever there were to be a real change in the politics of Taiwan itself, within Taiwan, to a strong majority of opinion in favor of declaring independence, which is not the case. But if ever there were to be such a sea change in political opinion, I don't doubt for a minute that military action would follow from Beijing, regardless of the cost calculations, because it is that, it's that important an issue. If you are a leader of the Chinese Communist Party, it's that important as an issue. And so that the risk of perception in Beijing, that of a kind of a now or never moment, is the thing that I worry about the most. If they felt there was a window of opportunity that was available today that would not be available a year from now, I think that's really problematic. And so I think things seem to have cooled off maybe a little bit, but we in the last month, but we are watching these things, all of us, month by month, and things can turn around. If you now have the new Speaker of the House of Representatives in Washington, make a trip, what will be Beijing's response? They've already set a strong precedent. Of course, last August, after the Pelosi trip, the military exercises went much farther than anything we've seen in the past. It was taking it to a new level. Will there be a dynamic in Beijing that says, well, now we need to go to an even higher level? I think there are significant risks there, and I think the politics in Japan are now, I think, playing an increasing role in the calculations of Beijing. You can see they're paying attention to this very carefully, and so I think there's a lot of tensions to be managed around that, around the cross straits issue, and Japan is inserting itself into those debates in a way that I think we didn't see a decade ago, and it'll be an interesting thing to watch. So you now have a 3 or 4 body problem to deal with, and the physics of that make the whole situation quite unpredictable.
Thank you. Alice, if you'd like to address the question of the European visits and also economic or security matters in the region.
Very difficult question. A lot of things may change until the actual visit takes place. I won't comment too much on Meloni's visit because I'm really not an expert on the Italian government and new orientation toward China. Regarding Macron, I think we can expect a more Europeanized visit. You remember when Macron previously visited China, he visited with German minister and European EU commissioner at the time, Phil Hogan, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure about the format, but in any case, I think he will really try to have a proper European, I would say, voice, or at least more, find various tools to Europeanize the visits, so that it's not just France interests that are defended, but more generally the general issue that are at stake, on the agenda of EU-China relations. Of course, the French presidency of the EU is over, and the Swedish presidency has signaled, if I'm not mistaken, the hypothesis of reopening the CAI file, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. I think we are far from being there, and many MEP are very opposed to that approach. So I don't expect, full resumption of EU-China relation as we have seen before COVID and before the sanction and counter-sanction on Xinjiang. So I believe the visit of Emmanuel Macron, even if very Europeanized, will be difficult. He may visit with an important delegation of company representative. We don't know yet, but even if it's the case, the visit cannot be just economic oriented. And any political topic is becoming extremely sensitive on the Chinese side, and is unlikely to lead to more cooperation. And in particular, also the topic of the issue of Ukraine. I mean, the issue of Russia's war in Ukraine. Macron will certainly try to exchange more on this topic, but I'm not very optimistic about the ability of and the willingness, most of all, of China to adjust in position, as I mentioned before. Regarding your previous question, Martin, about the financial mean of promoting an ambitious diplomacy, I just want you're fully right, and I fully agree with what Jeff said also. I would like to add that China still has now the first largest diplomatic network in the world. If you count the number of consulates and embassies, that's a counting that has been done by Law Institute in the past. First, before US diplomatic network, before French diplomatic network. And I also want to underline that, well, it's interesting diplomacy to analyze, because China's diplomacy have gained in professionalization since Deng Xiaoping professionalization process, actually. So they have became over the last 30+ years very professional in lobbying and communicating and negotiating, and general ability to promote their interests. And we are seeing at the same time, over the last 5 years, I would say undiplomatic practices, type of communication that is directly inspired from the Mao era. Sometimes countries such as Canada being accused of being running dogs of the US explicitly by diplomats. Expression, words, behavior that are maybe seen as unprofessional. So I guess this ambiguity will remain, and will remain even if it's very costly for China. It's costly in terms of image, clearly, and it's also costly with several of its key trade partners. Sometimes on some issue, it seems that China is willing to pay the price of its political and geostrategic position. When Jeff mentioned Hong Kong is losing in terms of attractiveness here to the benefit of Singapore. It's very clear from a Canadian or European perspective. A lot of regional headquarters of European or Canadian companies moving from Hong Kong to Singapore for the reason that we know. The fact also that, CAI has not been signed. I mean, the agreement has been frozen due to political reason. China would have gained in signing CAI, of course, but it's in many respects, one political issue that at stake really is not about economy. And Montesquieu would say, le commerce adoucit les mœurs, that through trade, the world ultimately becomes more peaceful. I think we have evidence now that it doesn't work like this, at least not in the actual interaction with China. And I believe that even if the economy continues to slow down, which is likely in China, and I agree that the real estate, I would say, the failure of the real estate, several of the real estate conglomerates such as Evergrande are having a very significant impact. But even in this context, China will invest massively in its diplomacy, just because it's not directly related. And and I know it sounds counterintuitive, but I think we have seen signs that China will still promote a very active and well-founded diplomacy. The diplomatic budget of China has doubled between 2011 and 2017. And we would have to double-check the latest figures, but I'm pretty sure that China, in this post-virtual diplomacy and more in-person diplomacy, China will reinvest in in-person visit as we have seen in recent months.
Great. Thank you very much. We have quite a few questions that I'm trying to follow everything. I think that you've already addressed a lot of the points that are being asked, but to continue on the question of the Chinese economic situation, there's a question about how it relates to potential political and social unrest in China, and whether, I don't know if there's a certain direct correlation between China's ability to sustain a certain economic growth and the risk of social unrest. But I'd love to have your views on this, and perhaps things that you may have learned or noticed in the most recent unrest that took place in the context of the zero COVID policy. Another thing I wanted to ask you is to come back to one point that Jeff made, and maybe to zoom out, looking at the region. But you said that a number of partners in the South Asia region are concerned about the resurgence of some sort of Cold War messaging from Canada, from the US, from potentially Europeans as well. What do you think should be the sort of engagement that North American or European partners could hope for with these countries who wish to continue to have a strong relationship with the US, with Europe, as well as with China for obvious national interests? How, in the context of the Ukraine war, some of them have been sort of hedging as well in whether they support a Russian narrative or support the one that is being developed by the West. So how do you see the interaction with these countries, and perhaps in the short and long term, how do you see Canada or European response to this issue? Let's start with you, Jeff, but Alice, you can also tackle both questions.
Yeah, I think on the first question about the economic growth, what's the political impact domestically in China of lower growth? I think we can only conjecture at this point because we've never seen that in the modern era. In fact, going back to the 1970s, we've never seen growth this low in China. The Communist Party leadership, they were in primary school the last time this kind of situation was encountered, or they weren't even born. So it's a very big question mark, and I think but I think it will have a very big impact. I think the deal has been there's been a social contract. Everyone knows it between the people and the party about delivering, continuing to deliver economic growth, and they're failing on that. And the longer the struggles, the longer growth is constrained in China, the more this is going to become a problem. So I think it's a very serious issue for the party. I think it's going to take a lot of attention from the leadership group, and that might have a bit of a knock-on effect on foreign affairs, potentially. I mean, China's a superpower, as Alice said, largest diplomatic network. They're investing a lot in diplomatic resources. Obviously, the leadership can do more than one thing at one time, but still, it's a small group at the center. And I think in an atmosphere where they're struggling with political challenges arising from economic structural issues at home, you may see on a day-to-day basis less, more of a desire to have things go quietly on the foreign affairs front rather than being really adventurous. But that's just conjecture at this point. But it really needs to be watched closely, and the social unrest in terms of local protests in the streets, in the thousands and thousands of towns and cities across China. I expect that we will see a lot of that in 2023. I mentioned all these people who are paying mortgages, making mortgage payments every month for apartments that have not been built yet. That's a pretty significant stakeholder group. I mean, many of them would be party members. So in fact, probably most of them would be party members. So this is something really to watch.
I realize that we're getting close to the end, so we'll have to be short in our answers.
Yes, and the second question was on the on
engaging with countries that do not want to choose.
Yeah, so my short answer to that is I think it's a situation that really calls for a very positive engagement, to have a positive agenda. I think it's a fundamental weakness of the position of the United States in the region, that the United States is not able to make trade deals, and this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Initiative specifically, the American officials cannot use the word agreement. They don't use the word negotiations. I think it is a factor we haven't talked about, but the ability of the U.S. to bring a positive economic agenda to the region is really handicapped, and that's a constraint, and it forces Washington into a kind of a security lens. So I think others from Western Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan, Korea need to step up more, invest more resources, be prepared with investment, be prepared to negotiate new trade agreements, which Europe is doing, UK is doing, Canada is doing, with countries and in the region and with ASEAN. And I think that's the kind of agenda that is needed. There's no appetite in ASEAN to have to choose between a China world and a led world and a US led world.
Thank you, Jeff. Alice, for concluding remarks. I think you're still muted.
Okay. Apologies, I saw that there were many questions in the Q&A box that we haven't addressed. So it would be I will do like a quiz, a very funny game. And if you need more answer, please contact me by email. I will be happy to help. But first question from Elliot Greenman. It's interesting question, but the answer is no. China will not go back to Taoguang at all, I believe, for various reasons. And the first one is that it's second largest economy in the world at this point in time, with the diplomatic network that we mentioned, and the ambition that are not the same at all as the one under Deng Xiaoping. Very interesting question also from Sébastien Chassot. Ideological roots. As you know, in my work, I think I underline that we should not underestimate the ideological drivers of China's domestic and foreign policy. At the same time, the way China communicates abroad tend to rather soften the ideological driver of this foreign policy, but it doesn't mean that it's not a strong driver. So I would opt for this ideological flexibility that you're mentioning, at least in terms of communication, but in the content, there is no change. And Nico Kepens, is there a possibility to convince them that Taiwan is no longer part of China? No. I mean, the whole official line is that Taiwan is part of China, so good luck with that. But happy to elaborate. So it's a whole new conference is needed to elaborate, but feel free to email me if needed. My email is available on Twitter.
Well, that calls for another event, another conversation. But thank you very much to both of you for having being so generous with your thoughts today. Thank you again to the Canadian Embassy in Paris for their support and the partnership with GMF. GMF will continue, of course, this conversation, and our Indo-Pacific program is in the lead to discuss all of these issues in 2023. So I wish you all a very good day and hope to see you soon online or in person. Goodbye.
Thank you.